So I was really when I so first of all, for those of you who are new, we're going to be focusing on the eighth house from a traditional astrology perspective. And so there are some differences, and I'll get into that in just a second. So one of the main differences is that things like sex are not involved with the eighth house. Things like, well, even there's all kinds of ways that we look at the eighth house, which have which are about derivative houses, or how, for instance, other people's money, which is because the seventh house is other people, and the eighth is the second house from the seventh. But really, when we are looking at the traditional astrology ideas of the eighth house, it's primarily called the house of fear, and the house of fear and the house of death. Hey, Anne Louise, welcome. And so, as a result, what for me, as I started looking at the different meanings, I thought all of the things that kind of constitute a horror film or elements of horror, basically, because that is essentially the eighth house, in my opinion, then also involves trauma. It involves terror, what we fear, who has terrorized us, what kind of fear we've experienced, what kind of anxieties we've experienced. But also, the eighth house is called the abode of Typhon, who is this monster in the bowels of the earth. And so when I thought about the eighth house and what I wanted to use for what do they call these, for a photo clip or whatever, or thumbnail, then I thought about this up from the grave, and I was thinking about Dracula, and I was looking for this gift that had, the hand of Dracula coming out of his grave. I thought it was coming out of the grave, but it was coming out of a coffin. But I wanted something macabre like this. And one of the things that's fascinating about the eighth house is that it's believed that the only planet that's actually good in the eighth house is the moon. And I was looking for some things around that, but I couldn't find it. There were a few things that I was looking for and I couldn't find. And the thing that I really want to say about this particular course today is you will not get a definitive answer about the eighth house, because the eighth house is about the mystery that cannot be uncovered, that cannot fully be uncovered. And I've been doing a lot of Vedic Jyotish related clubhouse things lately, and they talk about the eighth house as what you have no control over. Where you, like, for instance, they'll say, okay, the sixth house, you can see the bad influences of the sixth house coming. I ate too many pizzas, so I have this, stomach ache. But the eighth house is what you can't see coming. And so we're going to talk about all of this, but this is why. So as a result, I started watching Dracula and all of the issues around kind of Dracula and all of the trappings around horror, darkness, insects, spiders, rats, monsters, blood, the letting of blood sucking, mysteries that can't fully be understood, etc. All of those things kind of came up when I was watching. I watched both the original 1931 film of Dracula, and then I also watched the 2020. There was like a mini series, like a 3-part series of it, which was very much modernized, but still kept quite a bit of it. And so, in my opinion, once again, this thing about the eighth house being an abode of Typhon, who is this monster. And one of the things that we looked at was Jeffrey Dahmer, who was a serial killer's chart, and the strong influence of the eighth house in Jeffrey Dahmer's in his chart. And so I'm going to go out for a moment, and we're going to look at quite a few charts today, because I feel like, okay, I'm sorry, I'm kind of going all over the place for a second, but it's because this is a difficult house. It's because that I'm still getting also my grips on it, even though I've been studying for years and years, and because it's so subtle, and also because the eighth house is what we call the occult, but occult as in hidden, right? All of the parts of the body that are ruled by the eighth house are parts that are always hidden from view. Our genitals, our anus, obviously the bladder you can't see, the urethra is part of the genitals, right? But those privy parts, they even used to call them privy, private. We don't see them. So whatever is occultated or occulted is going to be hidden. And so there's this element of the eighth house that is the abode of Typhon is deep, deep in the ground in a place called Tartarus, who is his father. And so we're going to come back to Typhon in a second because because I'm going to go Jungian and think that the eighth house actually shows us where the possibility of our Typhon lies, of our own personal monster. What are the tendencies? What's the substance of the eighth house that can bring a monster out or not? And so let's just go through. This is Through the Ages. So this is from Deborah Holding's book. So this abode of Typhon, as you see, got me going down the rabbit hole. Then death and its nature, and everything that I look at from Valens in the 2nd century, everybody calls it death. Now, one of the things that I had seen a lot, but I can't seem to find, is they called it the idle place. And so that was something I was really interested in looking at planets in the eighth for that particular thing. If planets in the eighth showed themselves to be idle. And even Valens says that if there are benefics in the eighth house, that a benefic in the eighth house will still not be very useful. And so I wonder if that has something to do with it. We're going to talk about one of the reasons that the eighth house is considered a weak or a malefic house. So the kind of death, Formicus, no planet other than the moon rejoices in this house. There I am. And only in nocturnal charts. So that's where I was talking about. No planet other than the moon rejoices in this house. And I even had seen that it was only the waning moon, or maybe it was only the waxing moon. One of those two were the only ones that did well in that house. And I'm not exactly sure why. I really am not. Debilitated and passive because it does not aspect the ascendant. We're going to talk about this, and we're going to talk about this Epicataphora thing in a second, this gate of hell. All right, so now we move out of the Greek period into the medieval, like the ninth century, so medieval Arabic period, death, murder, poison, inheritance. So here comes the trauma. Here it comes as we start looking at, originally it was loss, penalty, trial, death in its nature. Now we come into murder and poison. So notice that poison is a silent way to kill somebody. Right? And Scorpio rules poisons. Mars, as the ruler of Scorpio, rules poisons. And so inheritance, obviously, because this is a legacy that you would get from the dead. And so later on, in the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century, we start seeing wills and legacies. Sure enough, wife's property, second from the 7th, we talked about that. Expenditure, and poverty. And death wills. There we go. So Lily is 17th century. Death wills partners' money, fear and anguish of mind. So here we coming back, bringing more of this traumatic aspect in, and then coming into the modern income taxes, legacies. Now, income and taxes has to do with what it is that you can't escape, right? So death and taxes, right? Those are two things that you can't escape. Shared feelings, sex, birth, and death. So we're going to look at a few charts to see a big business, insurance, crime. We're going to look at a few charts to see if any of that kind of comes up, especially around sex. This is something a lot of people like to use. And so I've got I've got a porn stars chart, and we'll see if we can find any sex in them. I had another chart of a person who was hypersexual. I'll see if I can find that one as well, and we'll look and see if the eighth house is. We're more than likely going to find that it is not. Okay, so this is one of the reasons that the eighth house is considered a house that is not particular. Well, I don't want to call it weak because it's not cadent. If you remember, cadent houses, and let's go here. Cadent houses, so the cadent houses are 3, 6, 9, and 12 were considered especially weak. As a matter of fact, the term for a planet in a cadent house was considered to be in retreat. However, there was also a belief that houses that did not aspect the ascendant, right? So if this is the cusp of the ascendant, we can see that the 11th house aspects by sextile, the 10th by square, the 9th by trine, the 7th by opposition, 5th by trine, 4th by square, 3rd by sextile. Okay, so these are any planets in those particular houses could make those particular aspects to the ascendant. However, if you remember when we were looking at Bonatti's 146 considerations, he said if a planet were in a Chaldean house and wasn't aspecting the ascendant, so a planet that doesn't aspect the ascendant is the 6th, the 8th, and the 12th, right? Because there's 150 degrees between the 6th and the 8th. I mean, the 6th and the 12th and the 1st, and the 8th and the 1st. And there's 30 degrees between the 1st and the 2nd. So those were all considered devoid of light. Here comes Maria, lovely. The ascendant represents the emergence of light, right? So your ascendant represents when a sign goes over the horizon, that becomes your rising sign. That becomes visible. That's why the first house in the ascendant represents your body, right? So the ascendant represents the emergence of light and represents the power of the life force in the chart. So the aspect that each house makes to the ascendant determines the quality and quantity of life energy the house can share in. This is why angles are considered so strong. This is also why trigons, so trigon would be the trines to the ascendant. Someone needs to mute themselves. This is why. Hold on one second. I'm coming to mute you. Did I get you? Okay, great. Hey, Mel. I didn't see you were in here. All right. So we were talking about why, right? We're talking about now, why is it that the 8th house is considered a malefic house? So the 6th house, the 8th house, the 12th house are all considered malefic. The 2nd house is also called one of these gates of Hades. We're going to come to that in a second. So this is from the 4th century. Suspended the former faces downward, the 8th house. The latter, the 2nd house, on its back. They either fear destruction at the hands of the neighboring cardinal or will fall if cheated of its support. Now, the 8th house is called Epicataphora. Epicataphora means falling down into the underworld. This is a clue, in my opinion, to what the 8th house represents. The 2nd house was called anaphora, which means rising up out of the underworld. And I want to use the example of poverty. So I think about, especially because you know I'm into music, I'm into jazz, I think about people like Louis Armstrong and Benny Goodman and Ella Fitzgerald. All of those people were raised in, well, especially Louis Armstrong and Benny Goodman were raised in abject poverty, like where they didn't know where food was coming from, where people were murdered. And Louis Armstrong came from one of the worst parts of New Orleans, where people were murdered all the time, knife fights. You know, he grew up in that kind of milieu. And of course, you can learn to enjoy anything or, you know, find joy in anything. But think of abject poverty. If you've been to India and seen abject poverty, it's a kind of hell. It's a kind of Hades. It's a kind of bondage. It's a kind of difficulty. And when you're in it, the way to come out of it is through financial gain. Financial gain becomes this way out of poverty. And, you know, it's that kind of what they call American dream story, you know, from the very bottom comes to the, you know, very heights. But this is the 2 gates of Hades. The gate of Hades where you fall in, which is the 8th house, and the gate of Hades where you come out, which is the 2nd house raises your status. Right, in the 30s, in the 1930s, you see all these films of women who are beautiful and attractive, but come from the other side of the tracks, and they're called common. Oh, that woman, she's so common, but she's married to that millionaire, and it's the money, it's her beauty and her money that's brought her up out of the squalor. And so the eighth house can be seen as that squalor. It can be kind of seen as that squalor. It can be seen as the trappings of whatever terrifies us, whatever puts us into bondage, whatever whatever puts us into bondage, whatever we are terrorized by. And so look at the difference. They either fear destructions at the hands of the neighboring cardinal, that's talking about the seventh and eighth house, or will fall if cheated of its support. And I think that's talking about how the second house will not fall, will do well if the first house isn't supported. Now, of course, you can use it in both ways, but I think about the destruction at the hands of the neighboring, because the eighth is the second from the seventh, so it's the assistant of your enemy. And so there's the destruction of the hands of the neighboring cardinal, right? The seventh house is the house of open enemies, or it will fall if cheated of its support, right? So, right, we can rise in fortune or we can fall as well. So rise and fall in fortune may have something to do with eighth and second, or poverty and wealth may have something to do with eighth and second. This is something I'm just putting forward. When we get to the charts, and we are going to get to them in a second, when we get to charts, I'm looking at them in a little bit of a different way. Earth brought forth when, justice to be the dread abodes of Typhon. This is where our Typhon resides, whom savage Earth brought forth when she gave birth. Okay, so here we've got the different names for the houses, the ascendant, the gate of hell, right? We just talked about that, and how it's anaphora and rising up from the underworld. Dea, Imum Sheli, which is the fourth house. Bona Fortuna, the good fortune, which is the fifth. Bad fortune, which is the sixth. The descendant, which is the seventh. The gate of hell, the Epicataphora, with casting down into. So one of the things I'm looking at is, are the planets in the eighth what make us go down in? Is the planet that rules the eighth what makes us trip down into the underworld? Theos, God, right? So ninth house, medium Sheli, bonus Daemon, that's the good demon. Malus Daemon, that's the good spirit, bad spirit, right? So good spirit is opposite good fortune, bad spirit is opposite bad fortune. But we're really talking about these gates of hell. So if we're looking at our eighth and second house as what makes me fall down in, and how do I come up? How am I able to come up? So the eighth, that of fear and death. This is from Al-Kabizi. That of fear and death, right? And inheritance, boom. The eighth house of death, it signifies fear and death and inheritance. So when we're looking for our traumas, right? When we're looking for our traumas, not when we're looking for our self-sabotage. So there's a difference between self-sabotage, which is our self-undoing, which is 12th house, and we're looking at what traumas have made us go into our self-sabotage. The eighth house may be those things. And the assets of women, right? That's the second from the seventh, and thefts, and the condition of opponents and poisons, right? So we looked at the poisons, signifies the ends of life and after old age. And then he talks about the different triplicity rulers, death, ancient things, and inheritance. And we might look at that later on too. House of fear, and it's called the house on the fact, this is all from Bonatti, and Bonatti was basically collecting everybody else's opinion from the medieval Arabic world, right? Ad-Dawlah says house of fear, house of death, on account of the fact that it belongs to the assistance of public enemies, which is what I said, and it follows the seventh. Abu Ali says it signifies labor, sorrow, wars, and those who despise, and the bellicose and the clients of adversaries. So this is pretty unequivocally not enjoyable. But we know that we've got people that have housed planets in the eighth, and they haven't turned out to be this horrible. I just saw something that somebody said that it can often be death that a person experiences around them, but not necessarily their own. But ultimately, one of the things that this is really coming up with is trauma and fear and terror, and what horrifies us, what horrifies and terrifies us. And now we come into something deposited for safekeeping and estate management, Mercury hour, and cunning and skills. So that's interesting to me. So this is going more with this management of an estate, which we start to see in the medieval period. Saul says, succeeds the Western angle and signifies killing and lethal poisons and whatever is inherited from the dead and all that perishes and labor. I think we got our point. Inherited from the dead. Heirship possessed after death signifies the end of years and life of old age. So ultimately, it looks like that's where we're kind of everybody says it's death. Death signifies death. ancient matters. So that's one interesting thing. Inheritance. So death and inheritance. It looks like what we're really coming down to. Eighth house dowries, right? Because that's the wife's goods. That's what you get from the wife when you marry her, right? And I think this one might be, yeah, okay, there we go. Hold on a second, sorry. This last one is from Lily. So it will probably be the most nuanced. It's from the 17th century. Death, its quality and nature, wills, legacies, and testaments of men deceased, dowry of the wife, portion of the maid, whether much or little, easy to be obtained or with difficulty. In duels, it represents the adversary's second. In lawsuits, the defendant's friends. What kind of death a man shall die? Fear and anguish of mind. Who shall enjoy or be heir to the deceased? The privy parts. So that gives us a pretty, shall we say, monodimensional idea of what the eighth can actually kind of represent. And so what I thought I would do is, first of all, I thought we would look to see if we can find any sex in the eighth house, right? So we know that sex, transformation, those kinds of things, there's this connection between Pluto's what is it? Pluto's rulership of Scorpio. So there's been kind of this conglomeration of kind of Plutonian Scorpionic symbolism that's when we're talking about from a Western non-traditional standpoint or modern standpoint, then that's kind of where all of the meanings of the eighth come from: the transformation, the renovation of identity, the rug coming from underneath you. And once again, when the rug goes from underneath you, then you fall into the abyss, and that's right where we are. So but let's see if we can find sex in this porn stars chart, in the eighth house in this porn stars chart. Okay, so the first thing that we see is Gemini is rising, and this guy is a bisexual, by the way, so that's interesting. And the ruler of the eighth house is Saturn. Saturn is up here in what we would call a human sign, which is Aquarius. And one of the things we know about Saturn is that Saturn is cold and dry. So Saturn is really not particularly amorous. We know that when Venus is connected to Saturn, that generally he's not particularly horny. Hold on a second. We've got a bit of a question. Oh, do you need me to zoom in? Does anybody else need me to zoom in? Because this chart is filling up my entire screen. So it might be on your screen, because I think it's, yeah, this is really, really huge. I mean, can I make it bigger? I don't know if I can. So let's see. Anybody else having a problem seeing? Whole solar flare, like it's small for you. Okay, hold on 1 second here. Okay, so we're looking at sex for this person, right? And whether or not the eighth house is involved in sex for this person. So the person would be found through Mercury, right? Because as ruler of the ascendant, and through the moon. And then we'd also be looking, the natural ruler of sex is Venus, right? But are either of them connected to the ruler of the eighth? So once again, as I said, Saturn is not a particularly sexual chart. I mean, a sexual planet. Saturn is Saturn is demotivated, right? Saturn is depression. Saturn is slowness and oldness, right? So Saturn isn't youthful vigor and virility, right? Saturn is the old person. Notice also that Saturn is with K2, right? So Saturn K2 does not sound like an extremely sexual placement for the eighth, if we're looking at the eighth house for sex. But look at the fifth house. If we look at the fifth house, we see Venus there, and we see the part of fortune there, and we see Venus on the part of fortune. If we look at the seventh house, right, which is joining and marriages and love, and often in the medieval period, they looked at the seventh house for sex. We see the ruler of the seventh, even though he's retrograde, in his own sign, which is also Venus's exaltation, and he's, what would we call it if a planet is being pushed forward, or a planet is advancing, if it's in the 10th house or the first house, if it's in an angle or succeeding. Oh, that's another thing. A planet is called in a state of advancement if it is in an angle or a succeeding house. A planet is called in a state of retreat if it is in a cadent house. In this chart, the ruler of the eighth is in retreat. There is no way that I would use the ruler of the eighth to represent this person's sexuality personally, right? What is advancing in this chart? Mars is the ruler of the sixth and the 11th. So the 11th is our future hopes and wishes. Mercury is the ruler of the ascendant, which is the body. Mars is in the first house of the ascendant. Mercury is the first ruler of the first house of the ascendant. Venus is in a succeeding house, and she's also on the part of fortune. Jupiter is the ruler of the seventh house, and he's the ruler of the 10th house. So this chart is pretty straightforward that this is going to be a very public life, and that something Venusian is going to be an important part of this person's life, and their body, that they're going to be involved with their body. It's going to be involved with their personal physique, right? But the Saturn doesn't have anything to do with that. Certainly, there is a separating square between the moon and Saturn, and there's a separating trine between Venus and Saturn. But we know that it's the applying things that we're really looking for, right? Those are the things that we're really interested in. And we've got the moon applying to Mercury. We've got the moon who rules the second house, and the moon is exalted in Venus's sign, right? So this is pretty straightforward, that the ruler of the eighth is not really involved in the sexual, shall we say, profile of this particular person. However, and please let me know, it is with this person. Let me know once again if the chart is too small or whatever, or if you still can see it okay. This is Jane Mansfield. Jane Mansfield was another one. Jane Mansfield was basically an imitation Marilyn Monroe in the late 50s, a more outsized version, very huge breasts and platinum blonde, and a fake voice, a character created by this person. But what she's really famous for is her death. Let's see. Small again, huh? It looks like what I have to do with these is actually go to the chart. I used to be. Is that better, you guys? Thanks for letting me know. That should be better, yes? Okay, so it looks like I'm gonna have to, okay, great, thanks. This is perfect, because now I know what to do in order to make it look good for you guys. Okay, thank you so much. All right, so she was decapitated in a car accident, is the point. And so one of the things that I found interesting about this chart is look at how the moon is the ruler of the ascendant. And in this particular chart, this is the Alcabitious chart, the moon is in the 9th house in Aquarius with the ruler of the 9th, who is also the ruler of the 8th. And the moon, as the ruler of the first, is the ruler of the head. The first house rules the head. So I thought that that was interesting. Notice also that we've got planets in the rulership of the head. And if I'm not mistaken, wasn't this the one that? No. Okay. Well, no, this wasn't. Okay, but there's another chart where the ruler of the eighth is, it's the Sharon Tate chart. Okay, I'll get to that in a second. But we've also got all these planets in the sign of the head too. Venus, Sun, Mercury, those are all in the sign of the head. So there is some kind of connection with the ruler of death in this particular chart, and or with finding death in this chart. Now, the thing is that there's going to be all this in between. There's going to be all of this. What's the word I'm looking for? There's going to be all of this. There's a substance to what, basically, when I was looking at charts right before this, what I came to was that every eighth house has its particular substance. And the substance kind of gives you an idea maybe of some things, but maybe not fully. But one of the things that is interesting is that the moon's next application is this opposition to Mars, who's accidents. So that's one thing. And the fact that Mars and Saturn are both rulers of Capricorn, right? Mars is the exaltation ruler of Capricorn. And note also then that Mars is in this mutual reception to Mercury. So there's this connection between, and Mars is in the third house, which is the house of short journeys, right? So this is the house of short journeys. Mars is a co-ruler of the eighth house. Mercury and Mars, Mercury is conveyances and cars and short journeys. Here's the ruler of short journeys right here, the Sun, in a sign that's ruled by Mars, which is also the sign that rules the head. If we look at, I'm kind of freeballing, so to speak, but all of it's kind of there. What I was looking at was actually the ruler of the part of fortune, and the part of fortune, the eighth from the part of fortune, right? The eighth from the part of fortune in this case is Sagittarius, which is ruled by Jupiter, and it's also the eighth from the third. So I guess fatalities or accidents. So maybe we can look at, originally I would have looked at the sixth house as accidents or fatalities, but fatalities or accidents would really be the eighth house. Oh, and now here's something. Those of you who've been with me for a while, we've talked about the Chaldean order. The Chaldean order is essentially the order of planets from slowest to fastest, starting from Saturn, then Jupiter, then Mars, then Sun, then Venus, then Mercury, then Moon. And instead of the sign per house thing that they would do, they would actually use the Chaldean order. So Saturn represented the first because that was the form-giving principle that made the baby happen. Jupiter, of course, is the significator for wealth, so he was for the second. The third house was Mars because he's the significator for brothers. The Sun for the fourth house because he is the significator for father. Venus for the fifth because she is the significator for how you get children and children. The sixth house was was Mercury because he represents servants. The seventh house was the Moon because most of the people getting astrology readings were men, and the seventh house represented their wives, and the moon represent wives and Venus. Then it women. Sorry. Then it started over again. Saturn became the significator for the eighth house because he was the significator of death. Saturn is the natural significator of death. And one of the things that the Jyotishis always say is, oh, Dusthana, the Dusthanas are the 6th, 8th, and 12th house. Those are the abodes of Saturn. Saturn is the suffering. Saturn is when we get to suffering. So there'd be what brings us to suffering, what can make us suffer. This chart had quite a bit of suffering, certainly at the end, and had a specific kind of death thing represented at the end. So it looks like what I need to do is stop the share and open the chart and then do the share again. It looks like that's the best way to do it. Where's Sharon Tate? Because the Sharon Tate chart is another one. Okay, so Sharon Tate, and let me know once again if this needs to be zoomed in, but this one should work. Sharon Tate was murdered by the family. The family were the people who followed Charles Manson. And actually, I have one of her killers. I have the chart of one of her killers as well. So Sharon Tate was married to Roman Polanski, who created Rosemary's Baby, and I can't remember what else. Oh, Repulsion, Rosemary's Baby, a few other very important movies of the 60s and 70s. And she was 8 months pregnant. She was about to give birth any week. And they broke into her house and they killed her, and they took her child, they killed the child, they ripped the child from the womb. I mean, really, really gruesome way of dying here. And so one of the things that we obviously see is the part of fortune is in the 8th house. And that the ruler of the 8th is Saturn. Notice once again this Aquarius and Saturn. So maybe we can see that if Saturn is involved, maybe we can start to have some kind of clue that Saturn's involvement with the 8th can often bring suffering. So let's just automatically, and maybe even bring death or near death. And what interested me about this chart was, so the ruler of the ascendant is the moon. The moon is separating from the square of Saturn, and she's applying to this Jupiter, which is lovely. This person was in a famous film. Sharon Tate was a beautiful, beautiful woman in this famous film called Valley of the Dolls. And it was taking off just at the time that she was killed. It was going to kind of catapult her to stardom. And so we can see these kind of some of these elevated aspects in the chart. The moon going to the Venus, the moon going to the Jupiter, this exalted Jupiter on the ascendant, this part of fortune with the Venus on it. So those, and also with the sun, right? All of these planets are on the part of fortune, giving heat and giving heat and light and power to the part of fortune and to the fortune, right? But we also know that it's all pointing to the 8th. And so what I want to bring your attention to is the trine between Mercury and Saturn. Mercury is leaving, right? He's retrograde, so he is actually leaving the trine, but the sun is translating between Mercury and Saturn. And for those of you who don't know what I mean by translating, I'm talking about translation of light. And translation of light happens usually when you have two planets that are in aspect. Okay, there we go. Okay, so Sharon Tate has a very there's ominous warnings. So the ominous warning I'm looking at is this Mercury to the Saturn. Why? Because the 8th house from the part of fortune is Virgo, and there's the moon, who's the ruler of the ascendant. And the 8th house from the ascendant is Saturn. Now, those of you who haven't been with me, you know I've been intimating about using the part of fortune as an ascendant. And this is us doing that. So in this chart, there is quite a bit of death-related stuff that could be connected. One, we've got the ruler of the 8th from the part of fortune. He's involved with all these things, even though he's combust, even though he's not that close to the 8th house. He's in that sign, and he's in the same sign as the part of fortune, so he's activating it. Then he's also would have been, if he were direct, would be applying to the Saturn, but he doesn't have to. Oh, we were talking about translation of light. Translation of light in this case is happening between the sun. The sun is translating the light between Mercury and Saturn because Mercury is moving away from it and Saturn is moving towards it. Saturn is retrograde. Mercury is retrograde. Mercury is at a lower degree. Mercury is the faster planet. he should be applying if he were direct. He's not. So he's going to go to 2, then 1. Meanwhile, the sun is going to go to 5. The sun is direct, sun never goes retrograde. And so the sun is going to translate Mercury to Saturn. So we've got the second house is doing that. And we've also got the 7th house, right? The 7th from the part of fortune. And one of the things too that they talked about with the 8th is that the 7th house is the actual house of death, that the 8th house is the house of the beginning of death. And in Jyotish, the 8th house is the house of longevity, right? Is the house of longevity. The 8th and the 3rd houses represent the longevity. The 7th and the 2nd represent the houses of death. So it was because the 7th house is where the sun goes down, right? It's where the sun penetrates the horizon and is no longer able to be seen. It's the death of the sun. It's the death of the sun represents life. But I think in this chart, we can kind of see that. What I want to do next is I want to look at some charts from a different standpoint, not necessarily specifically of trauma. I would like to look at a monsters chart, so to speak. But I'd like to just kind of, Olga. Hi, Olga, welcome. Let's just be sure. Okay, just making sure that that chart is seeable. What I wanted to do instead was I wanted to kind of look at the substance of the 8th house. As what I've been saying kind of about it is that the 8th house is where the unknowable secret, some of the unknowable secret that we can't, the unfathomable. I like that even better. The unfathomable, that which is unfathomable. Because remember when I was talking about Dracula, his powers are unfathomable. He can become a wolf. He can become bats. He has this power of hypnosis. He has this power of sexual magnetism. He, at the same time, only can come into a place if he's invited. He, at the same time, can't cast no shadow. All of those, or cast no reflection in a mirror. All of these are parts of this 8th house, this of the hidden, and all of the things, the creepy crawlies that go along with what scares us and the issues and the things that scare us. So what I'm looking for in these charts is there idleness? Is there an idleness that shows up in this chart because the 8th is called the idle place? Is there trauma in this chart because the 8th house can be our trauma? Or what can we say is the actual substance of the 8th house? And looking at it in this way, and those of you who feel comfortable saying, Layla, if you want to talk a little bit or whatever, but I want to look at it of what's the substance of the house? And the substance of the house is obviously based on the sign, the planets in the house, and the planet that rules the house and what's going on with that planet. Because what makes one person have access to a monster that kills, right? We can look at we'll look at this chart and then we'll look at Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, right? And there's a way that they found access to their Typhon, right? So we're looking for Typhon, we're looking for trauma, we're looking for idleness, and we're just generally looking for what is the substance of this person's 8th house and what is it contributing to? What does it contribute to, or also what falls down in? So the first thing is Venus is the gateway to the underworld in this chart. Venus is the gateway to the secrets. Notice how also the planet that's in the sign, the closest to the cusp, is also applying to the Venus. So we've got this Mercury, which is the ruler of the 7. Oh, look, it's the part of fortune. So part of fortune is in the 8th house. We know that the part of fortune can take on similar significations as the ruler of the ascendant. Look how also the ruler of the part of fortune is squaring the ruler of the ascendant, applying to the ruler of the ascendant as well from the 8th house. So this eighth house, whatever is going to happen, whatever is going to bring the Typhon is going to be relationships, right? It's going to be, and maybe even money, finances in relationship, because we also know that the part of fortune and its ruler represent our main significator for substance and financial prosperity. And if we go further in, we see cholera. Hot and dry is Mars. Hot and dry is Sun. That's called choleric. So as we go further in, and look, and they're both in detriment. So we've got highly choleric planets in here too that are detrimented and acting in mischievous ways. So knowing that the ruler of the part of fortune is applying to the ruler of the eighth, I think that what we can see maybe in this chart is difficulties with the lover's financial situation, right? The cholera happens once we enter, right? Once we enter, right, Mercury is counting. So when we get in here, the substance of it, there's all this cholera, and cholera is anger and arguments and contention and impotence, right? So there's anger and impotence. There's possible adventurism and not paying enough attention or too much optimism. Note that, remember, Jupiter is the ruler of the ascendant. So this is an and look, Jupiter is in Cancer. And remember, one of the things that we talked about when we talked about exaltation, we talked about how the difference between a planet in domicile and a difference in exaltation is durability. And that there tends to be a sense of unreality sometimes with the exaltation, or you know, taking too much for granted, or being maybe too generous, or being too optimistic. And so this exaltation of Jupiter already has the possibility of being too giving, right? It can give too much, and it loves to do it, right? It's in the fifth house. So this Jupiter likes to give. Fifth house is the house of gifts. This Jupiter loves to give. Jupiter is a benefic. Venus is a benefic. This person might also love to give to their beloved, right? The eighth house. And that might cause problems, or they might attract people that the beloved takes from them. And that causes this cholera. So what we could say is that, because also the eighth house in Jyotish is called the house of marital bond. If this person is in a relationship, then the financial issues are going to bring out the monster. But the nature of the monster is to already be too generous. So what happens maybe in this particular, right, the nature of the monster is to be too generous. That's Jupiter's generosity. And he's in the house of gifts. So in my opinion, what's probably happening is this person gives and gives, and also it's Pisces rising. Oh, of course. Person gives and gives, the other person takes and takes, and then Typhon shows up, then the monster shows up. The monster who resents being taken for a ride for doing those things. So it'd be interesting if AJW sees this, if we get a chance to get some kind of confirmation whether any of that is true. And I just want to go to Ted Bundy for a second here and see a monster. So this is the chart of a monster. And remember that Saturn is the significator for the eighth house, and Saturn is the significator of death. And look at how we use the part of fortune as a significator for the self, right? And a significator for the ascendant. And in this case, we don't even have to, because the part of fortune and the ascendant are the same. And so we've got this Saturn on the part of fortune, which already gives us, when we see Saturn in the ascendant, we tend to see depression and malaise and disorientation and disaffectation, right? And and unhappiness. and misanthropy. And so this Saturn is retrograde and also in detriment. So this would be a very misbehaved, badly behaved Saturn, and a choleric Saturn. Here's cholera again. So maybe we can say when we start to see cholera in the 8th house, when we see Saturn involved with things and we see cholera in the 8th house, I mean, I don't know, but we haven't looked at the substance of this 8th house yet. The substance of this 8th house is Jupiter, Venus in Scorpio and with Mercury. So one of the things about this guy is he was really good looking and a really smooth talker, and he went for women he was attracted to. He went for beautiful women. And he went for women that he was attracted to but couldn't have sex with. It looks like he was somewhat impotent. And so this Jupiter Venus, I usually call Jupiter Venus too much of a good thing. So addiction, it's in my opinion, it can be an indicator of addiction. And in this case, there is an addiction obviously in the sexual area, which is the scorpionic 8th house parts of the body, but about repression. I think of Scorpio not so much about hypersexual, but about the control until they turn that valve on. And then at the same time, looking at this trine between the Sun and the Saturn, and the fact that the moon is ruled by the Jupiter. So the moon is ruled by the ruler of the 8th, and look at how the moon is with Mars. So there's our killer, right? There's a person who can do harm to somebody. Both of these, this and this, a person who can do harm. Here we've got the Sun, we've got the Sun and Saturn actually talking to each other, communicating with each other, so that the Sun is the ruler of the ascendant in this chart. So the Sun, ruler of the ascendant, trining this misanthropic Saturn. Then we've got the moon here, ruled by the ruler of the 8th, right? The Jupiter, Venus, so ruled by this Jupiter, Venus. So this person was obsessed with beauty, obsessed with sexuality, obsessed with what they could and couldn't do sexually. And as a result, it made them angry and want to hit something. More cholera, hot and dry sign, fire, more cholera. Notice that Saturn isn't a choleric sign. So maybe when we start to see cholera involved with the 8th house, or look, we're not even seeing it with the 8th house. We're seeing it with the moon and the ruler of the ascendant and the ascendant. So maybe when we have these kinds of choleric aspects, I mean, something like this, Moon Mars, that's classic for a person with anger issues, right? That's a classic. Saturn Sun can be good or bad, right? It can work well, it can work not so well. But a Saturn that's in his detriment and that's going to be retrograde, Saturn is already stern, right? The light of the sun is also stern. What do they say? Put it on sunlight and watch everything kind of crawl away, right? So the light, putting things under the light of the sun. So we can see that there's a lot of judgment and a lot of stern judgment against the fellow man, and all kind of, shall we say, fueled by this addiction, this kind of sexual addiction, or this sexual addiction, but this addiction / repression that's also happening. So that's a different, but this monster expressed through this moon Mars primarily, and the Mars Pluto too. Woo-wee, all this stuff. And and look in the Jupiter Saturn, Sun Saturn, mind you, all of these things are separating, but we do find that these things do show up. They might not be, we wanted to look at this chart. Art Nunimus. So Art Nunimus experienced horrible trauma from the time I think she was 7 until she was 12 or 13. She was basically trafficked by her parents, sexually trafficked by her parents, and gang raped and beaten weekly was basically what she said. And notice once again, here's Saturn in the 8th. Now she lived on, she survived it, and she lived on, and she went on to to continue. One of the things that she did say was she had forgiven, I think her father did finally come around or something, but that her mother, that the person she will never forgive is her mother, and that the mother was a purely malefic character. And notice that the ruler of the eighth is in the 10th of mother. So so one of the things that we talk about with traditional astrology is that the fourth house is the parents, but primarily the father, unless we see certain things, and the 10th house is the mother. This gives us a very good indication that yes, indeed, we should be looking at the mother and looking at it rather for mother, and look at how also the moon is in the sign of the mother. She was at her mother's mercy. The father was the one who trafficked her, but it was at the mother's behest, and the mother supported it. And then after I think the mother tried to get her killed afterwards or something. There's all kinds of craziness with the mother. And so this is something where the Jupiter should be seen as possibly a benefic planet, but not. So what's in the eighth of this chart? What's the substance of this eighth house? Well, Saturn, who's already a significator for it, so suffering, but then Mercury, who's the ruler of the 12th, which is a bondage house. And then we've got the sun, the ruler of the ascendant, in the first house. In the 12th house as well. And then also, look, here's the part of fortune that would put these two planets in the 12th. So they talk about slavery and bondage. 6th house is slavery, and 12th house, 6th and 12th house are slavery and bondage. There she is with the ruler of the 6th. 6th from the part of fortune, Mercury. Mercury is a ruler of the 6th from the part of fortune with the ruler of the ascendant. So this is where we can see the trauma. Now, if we were just looking from the Jupiter, now look at also how both Mercury and Jupiter are applying, Moon and Mercury are applying to the Jupiter. Right, so and look at how the Moon just left the besiegement of the Saturn and Mars. Right, so she just left the conjunction of Saturn and the square of Mars, and now she's going to the sextile of Jupiter. So on some level, the Jupiter is also ruler of the 5th, and that's his, they would call it multricon, but that's his joy. So he can actually, he's doing both. He's been giving both. He's giving negative and he's giving positive in this chart, because she did escape it. And she did go on, and she's in her, as you can see, she's 1964. She's going to be 58 next year. Wrote a book about it, the whole thing. Wrote a book. So this is on the, so looking at some of these more negative related 8th house things, I'm seeing that we need to look at Saturn and where he is to get an idea of how bad it can really get, and whether or not the monster comes out or not. Now, this monster in this case isn't her, right? This monster she dealt with. This is the monster that she, the situation, the bondage was the monster, is in this particular, the bondage and the suffering is the monster that she had to, the terror that she had to go through. Questions? If you have questions, please write them in or go ahead and speak them up. At this point, I'm just going to go through charts and looking at substance of the 8th and what we think it may involve. So the first thing I see is that Saturn isn't too involved, thankfully, but we see this is similar to, now this is interesting, this is similar to Jeffrey Dahmer's chart, except it's not similar because it doesn't have the same lunar stamp, and it's not also similar because Venus is in Gemini, but it's a Taurus ruled 8th. So once again, Venus is taking us into the underworld, right? So Jupiter took the last person into the underworld. Oh, it's a zoom in, damn it. I thought I had. Damn it. Oh, there we go. Better? Okay. So We've got both benefics in the eighth. Better, please say better. Yes, great. And we've got the Mercury there. Notice that Venus is the ruler of the ascendant, which we don't love. Who else is in there with her? The ruler of the ninth is there. The ruler of the third is there, obviously, of Jupiter. And then the ruler of the sixth and 12th. So, and especially looking at the Jupiter and that he's in his, two, looking at the Mercury, who's in his own sign, looking at the Jupiter, who is in detriment. I think what we might find with this chart is some of the terrors might be around education or learning. There might be, now of course, this person should be relatively intelligent, right? It's not just the Mercury. Well, look, it's a stationary Mercury. So there could be something interesting about it. But it's not just the Mercury, but it's with the Venus and the Jupiter. This person could be highly intelligent. But notice how there's this fallen planet in the ninth. The Mercury is in the eighth. Here's a place where I wonder if the eighth is acting in an idle way. If, in fact, the ruler of the ascendant is also the ruler of the eighth in this chart, but with the main ruler of the eighth, right? Because the main, she's in the, or rather, the ruler of the ninth, but he's got most of the eighth. And I just saw an interesting rule. Al-Biruni says, if two planets rule the same house, and they rule almost equal or more the same, the planet that's in aspect is the planet that you use of the two of them. If neither of them are in aspect, then you use the planet. Yes, Mercury is enclosed by benefics. Yes, it is. And it'd be interesting to find out, but wait, let me just finish my thought, that you use the planet that's most dignified. So in this particular case, Mercury is really the main ruler of the eighth, based on this rule. Now, let me just, and yes, you're right. Whoever asked me if Mercury is besieged by benefics, yes, I think you're right. Yes, you are right. So what I'm saying is that the cusp ruler and the planet in the planet that rules the sign that takes up most of the space. In this case, it's Mercury, right? Even though Venus is in here, but Mercury is applying to this Jupiter. This is the second station, and Mercury is more dignified than Venus. So based on Al-Biruni's statement, we would use Mercury as the ruler of the eighth, which comes back to what I said, which is that I think that there's some kind of fear around education, learning. There might be, see, this person's intelligent, there might be a dyslexia or something that makes them afraid, or they might be afraid of speaking in public or speaking in front of people or making presentations or something like that. But I think that obviously it's a Mercury related monster down here. And so the monster, either they become or that terrorizes them. So, and Mercury, remember, is reading, writing, and arithmetic. So this person might be great with all the speech-related things. I just said something about, being afraid of speech, but might not be good with math, and math might be terrifying. So it could be as simple as that. I don't see a gigantic monster here. Yeah, sure enough, Saturn's on the ascendant, on the part of fortune. But look, Saturn is in his own sign on the part of fortune. There's a Saturn-Mars opposition, so that's not so nice. Okay, someone who fearing math irrationally, right? So there are people who do fear math irrationally, and we know that and it could also be, right? Venus is things that we like, and so it could be a fear of certain things that we like. There could be a sexual fear in this chart. Now, not because it's the eighth house, but because we know that Gemini and Virgo tend to be the sterile and virginal type signs. So there could be problems in this particular chart with, well, maybe it's not a problem with sex, but it could be a problem with commitment. And so there could be a fear of commitment in this chart, right? Jim, we all know that planets in Gemini that rule the seventh house, and look at it already, the ruler of the seventh is in fall. So we know there's already some issues going on with the love life. right? And Venus is the lady of marriage and intimate relationships. She's in Gemini with the ruler of Gemini, right? So we know that there is something about, there's a fear around being double-minded about something, being of two minds. I can't choose. Why do I have to choose, right? So there might be a fear of monogamy. I mentioned last week, yes, I did mention last week that Venus in Gemini is not a good place for love. I won't say it's not a good place. I'll say it's not the best place for commitment, for lasting commitment. And especially, if like Mars in Gemini ruling the seventh, that's really not good for love relationships. But even with this, we can see that this person is relationship oriented. So maybe the eighth house is all of the anxieties around the relationship. Our anxieties around relationship, around communicating around relationship. And so that might be the monster. And I saw that Melopoly is here. So I'm going to look at hers. Now I read from Melopoly on and off. But now that we're kind of looking at the eighth, and I'm looking at, and that's right, she's got the Mars there, and and we've looked at this in relation to the into legacy, but I want to look at it. I'm looking at it differently from this Typhon thing, and actually before I finish, we're going to talk about Typhon specifically because the Typhon myth, in my opinion, holds the key to the eighth house. So it's a Jupiterian monster, and Jupiter is about wealth and benefit, but also about children. And Moon is mother. So this person, if fears manifest, this person might worry quite a bit about their children. So the monster that might chase them is what could happen to my child. And look at how the Mars is squaring the Jupiter. And so Mars squaring Jupiter, so the fears could be accidents that could happen to my children. Mel, do you have fears of accidents happening to your children? Yes, and so she's a psycho about it, she said. So there's the monster. There's the monster. The monster is a Jupiter monster who wants to and Moon, right? Mama bear. Moon is protective mother. Jupiter is protector, right? Remember, both Jupiter and Moon rule Cancer. Isn't that fascinating, Anna Laura? Yeah. So this is the kind of monster that that's either terrorizing us or that we become. And so what will happen is she says she's psycho about it. It will manifest as the psycho. Look at the cholera. Jupiter's in a choleric sign, and then Mars is in Jupiter's sign. So Mars is what we call pushing nature to Jupiter. So this person, if they go into protective mama bear mode, they can do something that maybe they regret. Has that ever happened, Mel? It can, because Jupiter makes things bigger, more mad, more angry, more, it will push it out. We'll see if she comes out with that. But that's the monster you have to contend with. And so the monster is a mama bear, right? Because it's the Moon. And also now, let's see here. Okay, so there's a worry. And see, now let's talk about the Moon for a second, because the Moon is the mind, and the Moon is round and circular. So there's this element of circular thinking. She still cuts her 8-year-old's grapes. Okay, she worries a lot. Most ridiculous thing, cuts her 8-year-old grapes. If she tells me she pits them, I'm going to really be. But see, there's that Mars Jupiter going the extra. The action is extra, right? Mars is action. And this particular Mars, when it comes to this issue, this monster that is terrorizing them, they go the extra mile to make sure it won't happen. So if I have to pit my child's grape, if I have to peel it and pit it for them, I will do that, right? Just to make sure they never choke on it. I will never serve them. I will go through the fish. This is the kind of person, look, Mars is in Pisces. This is the person who will go through the fillet of fish to make sure there is no bone. It says fish fillet, but she'll go through it anyway, make sure nobody chokes on that thing, right? So it's things like that. It's that extra mile Mars that that this particular thing will show. Is there anybody else here who's in the study who is here today? Because if you're here and you want me to look at your chart, or if you've been in my thing before, then you know what I usually want is for you to go to astro.com, print out, get a chart, and then put that chart at imgur.com, and then send me the imgur link, and I'm happy to look at your charts, because I'm basically just going to be looking at charts for the end. So this is a good place to switch gears and come to what I was going to say about Typhon. This is a good place to switch gears and do that, because we have noticed that we have a Jupiter rule. Yeah, please do that, Olga. Please share your, anybody, those of you who are new and joining, please. I prefer Alcabitius, but if you put it in whole sign or whatever else, I'll obviously read it. But Placidus or whatever, Alcabitius is my favorite. And then upload your chart to IMGUR, and I'll definitely look at it. What I thought I would do, though, is go to this part about Typhon, because it was so interesting. First of all, here's the description. This is the excellent question that just came in. Would an 8th house perfection year encompass the same themes? I'm entering mine, so I'm curious. It absolutely would. It absolutely would. So Typhon, once again, is this monster that resides in the deep bowels of the earth, who is the child of Gaia and Tartarus. And Tartarus, the term Tartarus is used for kind of the bowels of the earth. Gaia is the goddess of earth. And they create this monster to fight Jupiter, who has already killed Kronos, his father, Zeus, who's already killed Kronos, who's been eating all of his children so that they wouldn't usurp him. And so Jupiter has decided, or Zeus has decided, that he's going to become king of the gods. And so he's at war with the Titans. So the Olympians, which Zeus is, are at war with the Titans, who are Uranus and Kronos and Gaia. And so Gaia and Tartarus create this monster, and Jupiter kills him with his thunderbolt. And here's a picture of that. So this is from a there we go. This is from, obviously, pottery. And here we have over here Zeus with his thunderbolts. And here we've got, so Typhon is a serpent, but it has wings. And supposedly it has all of these serpents at his neck, and its fingers are serpents as well. But so this is Typhon. So the myth of Typhon points to Jupiter as the slayer of Typhon. And so I find that to be important. I find that particular thing to be important, because that means that, because essentially the 8th house can be a house of hopelessness. It can be a house where, if you remember what I said earlier, it can be a place where we don't have control over what happens, nor do we see it coming. imgur.com. I'm going to put it in the chat as well. imgur.com. So Jupiter, remember that Jupiter is the ruler. You're welcome. Jupiter is in his joy in the 11th house. The 11th house is called the good spirit. Jupiter is the good spirit. Jupiter, the 11th house, is also called the house of hope. And so Jupiter involves that hope. So here's the thing. Melopoly has a Jupiter monster, right? Or a Mars Jupiter monster, right? So the thing is, what what we can say can be the antidote to this person's fear is trust. Part of the problem is that Mel doesn't trust. So because she doesn't really trust, she can't really let things go, and she'll worry instead. And so what she has to do is this kind of letting go, trusting in the benevolence of the world kind of thing, which of course with this chart is going to be difficult. But it is doable because the Jupiter is stronger than the Mars. And not only is he stronger than the Mars, but he's the ruler of the Mars, and he's the ruler of the 5th house. So in some ways, the way out of this particular, especially because the Jupiter is the monster, is he needs to focus on what he enjoys rather than what worries him. And so and it's also focus on what the child enjoys rather than what worries them about what the child is doing. Since we know that the child is involved in this situation. Right? Okay. I'm going to go on to another one until the IMGR links come up. And just kind of looking, I'm going to look at iSelf. I just talked to her a little while ago, and I think we looked at her maybe the week before last. So we got another. So I'm calling it communication, not because it's Mercury, because it's Gemini. So we've got another communication, thinking and communication monster. We've got a Mercury monster. And so how can Mercury terrorize once again, right? Mercury. Now, here's the thing. This Mercury is also combust. One of the things about combustion is blindness. Beautiful, Olga. Thank you. One of the things about combustion is blindness, how we are blinded by things, or we are blinded, or we don't, or delusion, we are deluded. One of the things I remember talking about when we first started was how many charts I see of people asking for fame that have combusted Venus or have combusted Mercury, right? So it's because remember, the sun represents fame, the sun represents royalty, the sun represents pride and arrogance. And so the sun represents the sun and Jupiter, right? The Jupiter inflates, right? So Jupiter is inflation, but the sun represents the delusion of grandeur. The grandeur is the Jupiter. I mean, the sun, right? So the delusion of grandeur. And look, we've even got a separating sun-Jupiter trine. So there could be delusions of grandeur or there could be, I think, or the opposite, there could be expectations that are much bigger than what we feel we can do. And as a result, they scare us, right? Because Mercury is skill. And here with Mercury and the sun, right, the sun is obscuring, the sun is illuminating or obscuring. So what I think is probably happening with this chart is the Mercury monster says, I'm not as skilled as I'm supposed to be. I think that there is an overestimation of what it is that they have to do and where they fall in particular place. The ruler of the ascendant is the Venus. Venus is in her own sign. This is a talented person. The Mercury is in its own sign, even though combust. The Venus is in its own sign. This person is talented, but the Mercury monster, I think, is creating a taskmaster, maybe even quizzing itself. Remember, it's also, I can't make up my mind. It's of two minds. It tends to be of two minds. Mercury tends to be of two minds. So there can be a problem of I can't make up my mind and my expectations are so high. Look at how Mercury rules the 11th, right? So that gives even more credence to what I'm talking about here. Okay, so it's a whole. I'll use thank you, Olga. I'll use the chart that has the other, that has the quadrants. But so then the Jupiter is the Jupiter in the 4th ruling the 5th. Once again, this person, it looks like this person needs to find what's home to them, find their sense of welcome. This person feels unwelcome, if that's the case. right? So there needs to be a sense of welcome. This person needs to be more welcoming of their own skill and ability, and they have quite a bit. But look at, see, we've got the Saturn in the first house, we got the Pluto in the first, we got the K2. So there's all this disaffectation in the first. There's a malaise, I don't know that I really want to. There's a Saturn, I sometimes am too depressed to be able to. There's a Pluto, I can barely get, feel in control of my thing. And then I don't have a clear vision of my abilities, and my expectations are so high. Let's look at Olga. Can everybody see? I think this is as big as it will get. Oh, everything's above the horizon, so that's interesting. All right, so the eighth house. Look at how the sun is. Oh, okay, so this is a solar monster. This is a solar monster, and so the solar monster goes both ways, and which is interesting in my opinion. It will go both ways. It will be too much overestimation of who I think I am. It will be, I don't know who I actually am. I'm terrorized by what I am and what I can become. Look at how the Venus is there. So the relationships are involved in this too. So the sun, who am I, is the real fear, right? And not being able to live up to maybe other people's idea, because like the sun is in Leo, so it wants to be perfect. It wants to be seen. It wants recognition. So actually, there it is. Recognition is an aspect of the fear, right? Because the sun, more than it wants fame or whatever, we meet all kind of Leos who never talk, who aren't in the public eye, but look them over when they've done something, and they'll scratch your eyes out. So this, in my opinion, the ruler of the, and this is another situation here where the Mercury might be the real ruler, right? But since we've got the sun here with the eighth, and of course, Olga, let me know if I'm off or on or whatever. What we have here with the eighth here, it's the sun is the gateway into it, right? So it's the who am I, and here's the other thing, the sun is also God and religion. So there could be issues around religion. Note that the ruler of the ninth is in the eighth, and the ruler of the ninth is fallen and retrograde, right? So there could be aspects of religion and spirituality that have brought me. Have you dealt with any kind of spiritual abuse at all, Olga, or been in any kind of spiritual environments where that created fear?
Yes, absolutely. I grew up in an extremely religious country that completely contradicted everything that I grew up understanding as spirituality. So yes, absolutely.
So God is the monster, right? The sun is God. So did you grow up feeling God is the monster?
I grew up feeling afraid, not afraid, really resentful and really angry towards dogma and religious people that demanded God to be worshipped a certain way. I knew that God was never the enemy, but I knew the people who claimed to work on his behalf were not the most pleasant.
Interesting. So not God himself, but religion. But the religion is the monster in this chart. So and so we can see that, and we can see a few things. If you remember from when we talked about learning about the ninth house in religion way back when, the Mars is the ruler of dissent. And then we already know that the sun is the significator for God and religion. And then we see here that the ruler of the ninth is in its fall and retrograde. So it's not going to fully accept. Right? It's not going to be able to fully accept. And then we've got the Mercury exalted in the eighth. So what would create the fear is my own mental independence. So my mental independence and my sense of rationalism, and also, as you said, the things that made you angry about religion, this is kind of what would terrorize this particular native, or be the nature of the monster. What's interesting to me about you is that it feels like you are working with the Jupiter thing for the eighth, because the Jupiter is the mercy, and you feel very merciful towards what you came from. And see, notice how the Jupiter is here. Like, you're not saying, yeah, religion sucks and blah, 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 blah. And you made a really important distinction. No, God is not the problem. How people think, not even religion is the problem. How people think religion has to go. And that to me shows that there's a lot of mercy, a lot of thinking about it, but a lot of thinking about it through the lens of mercy and compassion, despite how terrorized by it. And there's Venus, and there's Jupiter, and there's the Jupiter in the same sign with the Mars, and with the Moon as well, and in that trine to the Mars, right? So you can't be fully mad, right? You can't be fully mad because the Jupiter wants to temper a lot of the ire. Oh, there we go. All right, there's Anna Lara. Any question about that? So here's the thing. I'm stumbling on it. I've stumbled on it. The eighth house has always been a house that I haven't really I can't say I don't understood, but a house that felt like, shall we say, it's too pat, or it's at the same time too reduced and too complex, right? It's too reduced to really give depth the credence for it, and too complex to not get to fully be able to get into it. But like I said, when I was looking at these charts and finally thinking, let's just look at the substance. Thank you, Olga. Thank you so much for sharing your chart with us. Let's just look at the substance and look at this thing of, it's where the monster is. And it's, so the monster is either us or it's what's scaring us. We're either the monster, it's either scared us enough to turn us into it, or it's scaring us. So let's look at this chart. So Saturn, it's a Saturn monster. So already we know judgment is a major, major thing. And in this chart, what may have scared, so Saturn in Libra is often what I call decorum, and Saturn in Libra is Emily Post and what's the word? Etiquette. So this person might be terrorized by etiquette. So the things that you might come from an upscale kind of background where you use the correct spoon, or we do things this way, or you always there's a formality. So formality would be the monster in this chart, and not just formality, but formality and luxury. So that's why I'm saying, grew up in poverty, but I am this person now. Okay. So it started in poverty, but came into that, right? So the karma of this chart is the confinement, right? And so we're going to talk about that in a second, the eighth house and prison. So fourth house, eighth house, 12th house, and imprisonment, and how all of them have to do with confinement and capture. But the confinement of the eighth house, and that in this particular case, the confinement of the eighth house is luxury and decorum. She may have married into a very traditional old family, but it's that kind of thing. Not that fork, that fork. And we always do this on Thursdays. And you never say blah, blah, blah about blah, blah, blah. And all of these kinds of ways in which you can constantly be judged. And obviously the marriage is an aspect of it, because Saturn rules the 7th as well as the 8th. So then also there'd be an aspect of marriage or relationship, and there'd be an aspect of the fear around money, fear around my lover's money or the other person's money, hopefully for future partner. So fear around the other person's money. So now, interesting, you said that you grew up in poverty, but you become that person now. So the Saturn monster is maybe the monster that you yourself have been used for money by partners, right? So what this chart wants to look at is actually, right, if we're talking about Jupiter as the antidote to Typhon, right? So we've seen that this monster is this Sun Saturn monster, and it wants a certain stature. It's the chart, not necessarily you. The chart wants a certain stature because the Saturn is exalted, but it's also combust. So it's the wanting but not having. It's the maybe if I follow these strictures, I'll have it, but not still getting it. And look, it's also with the Venus and maybe the things that I think I have to do in order to have love, right? Because the Saturn is involved too. So the Saturn is involved. So the fears are really around how presentable am I as a person, not just financially, but in all the areas. What's the word that kind of what's the word? Eligible bachelor, like how eligible, and that will terrorize you. This is a self-terrorization happening here. In my particular, to terrorize oneself with my suitability. That's it, my suitability. And do I follow the correct rules? And part of the problem is that this moon Jupiter, which should be helping, is in Scorpio, which is a control freak. And so this person feels more comfortable when there's something they can do to make it right. And so the fear of the eighth house makes this person box themselves into certain actions or ways of doing things because they think that's the way that they're going to be the most suitable or the most presentable. And it's not true. What actually has to happen in this chart is radical self-acceptance and self-mercy. Because Saturn and the Sun have no mercy. Saturn, right? We talked about this. Saturn is cold and dry, and he is absolutely the worst taskmaster, right? Learn to be so the whole thing about this chart is the fear of the authentic self that they have to overcome in order to be it. And the need to give up, and the need to give up the need, which is so difficult in this chart, to control their surroundings and their situations and what they think will bring the future they want. Because note that the Venus, the ruler of the 11th, is here too, so representing the future, right? So this person has this, and most of the dreams are romantic related. So this person has love dreams of the future, or just dreams in general. So safety, yeah. So so this issue of safety, the problem of safety is the moon in Scorpio rather, but the Jupiter, what's going to have to happen for you is you're going to have to be more Jupiter with your moon and less Scorpio with your moon, right? So you have to be nicer to yourself. You're going to have to be more lenient, more permissive. You're going to have to you have to give yourself more permission to just let go and be nothing. This chart can't necessarily be nothing. You need to be able to be nothing and be perfectly happy with that. Okay, so I'm going to stop the shares. One more thing. It is, and the problem is because the Sun and the Saturn together are creating that issue, right? Because the Sun hates any kind of, it doesn't hide in corners, so it hates to be obscured. And then Saturn is extremely judgmental, and always, oh no, that's not right. Oh no, don't do it that way, right? I mean, that sounds like Virgo too, right? But really, it's really more of, it's that taskmaster aspect of him and unforgiving. So that can be an aspect of you for yourself, right, as well. And so that's why the moon Jupiter, it's not going to help you if you try to control things by actions, but just be as passive, as permissive with yourself as you can be. I want to go to one of the very last things I wanted to talk about, because that brought up a very interesting thing that I saw in Bonatti, where he talks about the differences between the 8th, the 12th, and the, okay, one second here. He talks about the 8th, the 12th, and the 4th, and how they all represent prison. So Dallas said the 12th house signifies hidden enemies and deceivers. Let's see, blah, 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 blah. And certain others say that all the lords of the triplicity of the 12th signify prisons and the incarcerated. And others said that the 8th house signifies the incarcerated. And others said that the 4th signifies prisons. But one did not contradict the other, because the 4th signifies prisons because it signifies capture and the act of capturing itself. Indeed, the 8th signifies prisons because it signifies the act of incarceration itself. Indeed, the 12th signifies prisons because it signifies the place of the prison, and the incarcerated person already captured. And in this they differ. So think about that for a second. Especially, we just go to whatever chart this is, I self. So what they're saying in that particular case is that we incarcerate here and we find ourselves in prison here. Right? So we incarcerate. So the monster that is basically threatening us is we're incarcerating ourselves. And we saw that with Olga, right? That Olga basically is incarcerating herself and she's imprisoning herself. She finds herself in prison in the 12th, but she is incarcerating herself using the ruler of the 8th, using the Saturn, and that very strong Saturn who has very strong, so she incarcerates herself with all of the decorum that she puts herself through. And the prison she finds herself in is after she's done that. So that would be the way of looking at it. So kind of the same thing. This person is incarcerating themselves with Mercury. And look, Mercury also rules the prison itself. Naked and seen. Woo. We'll put some clothes on, girl. I have a lot of possibilities. I can go on and just look at other charts and we can just kind of look at everybody's monster. I can take questions. We can open it to discussion. I'm open. Let me know what it is you'd like to do. I'm really, at this point, I'm open to whatever you like. I mean, anyone?
I have a theory.
Yeah, Olga, what were you gonna say?
Sorry, I just had a very quick question. When I started taking astrology a lot more seriously, I truly believe that you cannot be, like planets cannot be fully benefic or malefic without balancing each other out within their own nature. So when we talk about I really love the phrase that you've been using throughout the entire session, which is talking about our monster. How would you recommend we make amends with those monsters and use them to our benefit? Much like Medusa, that was actually seen as this horrific monster that petrified. How can we positively, do you think you would recommend using that kind of energy for our own individual journey?
I love that. I love all of that question. And I want to address the very first part of the question, which was about planets being benefic and malefic. And I have very specific ideas about that my students know. So first of all, there are what we call naturally benefic planets and naturally malefic planets. Any planet can become functionally malefic or benefic. And there can be a mixture of significators. The issue that I find a lot with modern astrology is that it's not really good at ambiguity. And in many cases, we can find very ambiguous planets that should be a Jupiter. For instance, we found that Jupiter in Art Nunimus's chart, which was the problem with all of the gang rape and everything that had happened, right? And the problem with the mother, right? So it was in Venus's sign. It looked like it should be nice, but we had all of these other things that were showing that the substance of the 8th was not so nice, and that him advancing in the way that he was also not. So to answer the second part of your question, 2 parts. The first part is using the Typhon myth. The key to the 8th house is not necessarily the monster itself, but is Jupiter. So that the natal Jupiter is the key to the 8th house in the chart. Now that's one way of looking at it, okay? The other way of looking at it is this. to come back to where you started, everything is expressing both ways, right? Everything has the ability to express both ways. The main thing that I talked about with the eighth house is the unseen aspect of it, right? That there's all of this part that represents the mystery that cannot be fathomed, this unfathomable. So inherent is light, right? Because remember also how we started, it's one of those houses that doesn't aspect the ascendant, so doesn't get the light. So it's the light of consciousness that shows us who the monster is, that then shows us we have nothing to be afraid of, and how the monster can react instead. So to use Mel's chart, for instance, Mel's chart had or even to use yours, rather, since you're the one that asked the question, but we'll talk about Mel's in a second too. So your chart was the one that had the trauma around religion, right? Okay, so your chart was the chart with the trauma around religion, and what you did was exactly that. You not only tamed your monster, but you saw that it wasn't a monster, it was just a way that people live, and that you didn't have to participate in that particular method. So it no longer became a monster, it became that animal that lives over in that part of the island. And I live over on this part of the island. And because of your ability to show mercy, that Jupiter moon thing that you have, which is different from Ann Laura's Jupiter moon, right? With two people who both came in for the first time, who have this moon Jupiter conjunction of sorts, but because of yours, which is in Jupiter's sign, your ability to have mercy for that situation was so much easier, and that was your ability to heal it and no longer be afraid. And Alara's, it has to be on herself. She has to show mercy to herself. So Jupiter is one way, and then the light of consciousness, so to bring it to Mel and what's going on with that Mars-Jupiter square, she's worrying all the time, which makes her be hypervigilant and do things that aren't necessary. But once she sees it, then she says, oh, I see I'm worrying, and no, I don't really have to worry. And we have so much more fun than if we do both, right? Because the fifth house was involved. So if we can have fun, if we can enjoy ourselves, then the monster lives on that side of the island. And the monster does that thing, and we do our thing. And so this whole thing you just said about the darkness, eighth is where the darkness is, but we have to embrace it to be whole. We have to have all of it.
Yeah.
That's what I love about traditional astrology, right? We don't have to sugarcoat anything. We can say this is garbage, and then we can say now, but this is how to deal with that, or this is the remedy for that, or this is the blah 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 for that, right? So we don't have to stop at determinism and shitty situations. We can create. And so the eighth house is what we can't escape: taxes, death. We can't get away from it. We can tame it. There's the transformation aspect of it. We have to, by being in constant work with it, because it's ours, it's in us. So, or it's manifested outside, that's then creating internal trauma, right? So so either the monster's outside of us and it's creating this internal trauma, or it's like with an Laura, it's an internal trauma that we've created for ourselves, and so we're in our prison, right? We've incarcerated ourselves with this trauma, and now we're in that prison of self-undoing. 12th house.
Mm-hmm.
That answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much for that. That was wonderful.
All right, thank you. Beautiful question. More questions. I love them. Questions, please. Anna Laura, were you going to ask something? No. I'm gonna stop the recording here.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, there you are.
No,
Good.
I don't have any questions. Hi. No, I don't have any questions, but I do have some commentary in that. I am my own worst enemy. I am so hard on myself, and the way you've explained how I caused my own undoing. I mean, I've never really heard it delineated that way. So thank you so very much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Now, I don't just mean questions about, like, if you have questions generally about, like, I might have talked about something more general that you have a question, feel free. I mean, I'm going to stop the recording and